A group of English settlers arrives on the shores of a mysterious land. They seek fortune, new beginnings, and the promise of a new life. But within a few short years, the colony would vanish without a trace. What happened to the Lost Colony of Roanoke remains one of America's most enduring mysteries. In this video, we'll unravel the story of Roanoke, from its ambitious beginnings to the baffling disappearance of its settlers. To understand the story of Roanoke, we must first look back at the ambitious motivations of England in the late 16th century. At this time, England was locked in a fierce rivalry with Spain, the dominant global power. Spain controlled vast territories in the Americas, and England, under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, sought to challenge this supremacy. Queen Elizabeth's desire to establish an English foothold in the New World was motivated by several factors: the quest for wealth, a desire to compete with Spain, and the hope of establishing a permanent English presence on the American continent. In the early 1580s, the English began to look to the New World for expansion. Sir Walter Raleigh, a courtier of Elizabeth I, became the leading figure in organizing expeditions to North America. Raleigh's aim was to create a colony, a base for trade and further exploration. Roanoke, located on the coast of what is now North Carolina, became the site of this ambitious venture. It was hoped that the colony could become a secure English foothold in the New World, a springboard for future settlements and trade routes. In 1585, the first group of settlers, led by Sir Richard Grenville, established a colony on Roanoke Island. However, due to conflicts with the local Native American tribes and limited resources, this colony was abandoned within a year. In 1587, a new group of 115 settlers, led by John White, set out for Roanoke with the aim of establishing a more permanent colony. White, an experienced artist and explorer, had previously been part of the 1585 expedition, and his leadership was considered crucial for the success of the new colony. These new settlers were not just soldiers or sailors. They included families, women and children. There were artisans, farmers and craftsmen, each hoping for a fresh start. The decision to leave everything behind in England was not easy. For many, this was an opportunity to escape poverty, religious persecution, and the rigid class system that dominated their lives back home. For others, it was a leap of faith into an uncertain future, a dream of riches, land, and freedom in the New World. The journey to Roanoke, however, was far from smooth. The settlers faced delays due to supply issues, adverse weather conditions, and a lack of experienced sailors. Their journey took longer than expected, and by the time they reached Roanoke in July 1587, tensions were already high. They were far from prepared for the harsh realities of a strange, untamed land. John White's illustrations offer some of the clearest glimpses into the daily life at Roanoke. He documented the settlers' interactions with Native Americans, as well as their efforts to adapt to a new and unfamiliar environment. White also made notes of his experiences, observing the challenges of establishing the colony. The settlers did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived desperate for help, isolated and out of their element. Initial interactions with the CROATOAN and Powhatan tribes were cordial but tense. The English settlers needed food, guidance, and resources, and they were willing to trade goods for survival. However, this fragile cooperation would not last. Life was incredibly difficult. The settlers had to build everything from scratch: houses, fortifications, even gardens to grow food. The land, while rich in natural resources, was not kind to those unfamiliar with it. The settlers struggled with food shortages, harsh weather, and disease. Even the strongest among them were beginning to feel the weight of isolation. For the families, it was especially hard. Mothers worried for their children, families longed for the comfort of their homes in England, and the overwhelming silence of the wilderness pressed in on their hearts. But there was no turning back. Many were too proud, too invested in this new life to even consider leaving. Amidst the hardship, there was a moment of joy. John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a daughter of her own, John White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the New World, symbolizing hope, renewal, and the promise of a new life. For John, Virginia Dare was a symbol of his family's future, a living tie to England and the new colony. He had hopes of seeing her grow up in the New World. a place that he had dedicated so much of his life to establishing. In her, he saw the possibility of a thriving colony, an English presence in America that could last for generations. But this dream would not last. Despite the arrival of Virginia Dare and the settlers' early optimism, the harsh realities of life in the wilderness began to take their toll. The colony, though established with such hope, was on the brink of collapse. Supplies were running low, and tensions with the native tribes were increasing. Still, John White's love for his family and his sense of responsibility to the settlers drove him to stay and fight for their survival. In the summer of 1587, as the first child of English descent was born in the New World, Virginia Dare, John White made the difficult decision to return to England. He left behind his family and the fledgling colony, promising to return soon with much-needed supplies. He would never see them again. At first, the settlers hoped that their leader would soon return, bearing provisions, reinforcements, and news from England. But time passed, and the situation in Roanoke grew more dire with each passing month. The settlers, abandoned on an unfamiliar, hostile coast, struggled to survive without the resources they had been promised. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. The island became a prison of isolation. As the settlers faced the harsh realities of life in the New World, their supplies were running out. The land, though fertile, didn't offer the abundance they had hoped for, and the once hopeful interactions with the Native American tribes began to sour as tensions rose over food and territory. Every day they anxiously awaited word from England. But no ships came. What had happened to their supplies? What had happened to their leader? Then, in 1588, disaster struck. The Anglo-Spanish War broke out, and England was forced to focus all its attention on defending itself from Spain's vast armada. For John White, this meant his return to Roanoke would be delayed indefinitely. The settlers, now cut off from any hope of reinforcement or rescue, began to fear the worst. Was their colony doomed? Were they abandoned to face their fates alone? From England, John White watched as the world around him descended into chaos. His heart ached with the knowledge that his people were stranded in a foreign, perilous land. But even as White fought to gather resources and organize a rescue mission, the question loomed larger than ever. What had happened to the colony in his absence? 3 long years passed before John White was finally able to return to Roanoke in 1590. In that time, the fate of the colony hung in the balance. Were they still alive, or had disaster struck? White's heart raced with anticipation and dread as he approached the island. As they sailed toward the island, White could hardly believe his eyes. The once thriving settlement was gone, the fortifications had been dismantled, the houses abandoned. Not a single settler was in sight. The colony, which had been so full of life, was now eerily quiet. Where had they gone? There were no signs of struggle, no burned-out buildings, no bodies. Everything was just empty. The only clue left behind was the word CROATOAN carved into a post, and crow scratched into a nearby tree. White immediately set out to search for the missing settlers. He sought to investigate the nearby island of CROATOAN, where he hoped the settlers went to seek refuge, either with the CROATOAN tribe or perhaps hiding there to survive. However, fate was cruel. As he and his crew navigated the treacherous waters near the island, a fierce storm suddenly rolled in, making it impossible to reach the island. The storm raged for days, battering their ships and forcing them to turn back. White watched helplessly as the island of CROATOAN, which could have held the answers to the mystery of the missing colonists, faded from view. He was forced to return to England, leaving the mystery unsolved. After his return to England, John White never gave up on finding answers. He continued to write letters to his patrons and the English government, urging them to send more expeditions. His heartache was palpable as he detailed the tragic fate of the settlers. In his writings, he expressed a deep sense of loss, not only for the colony, but for his family, who had been among the settlers. White never saw his family again. He continued his efforts to search for the lost settlers. His last recorded efforts were attempts to organize another expedition to search the waters near CROATOAN, but he never received the funding and support he needed. John White's life was consumed by the hope of finding answers. But time was not on his side. Despite his passionate efforts, he died without ever knowing the fate of his daughter, granddaughter, or the rest of the colony. Over 400 years later, the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke endures. Despite many theories and discoveries, we may never know the true fate of the settlers. Whether they assimilated with Native American tribes, perished due to disease or starvation, or vanished under mysterious circumstances, their story remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most perplexing disappearances, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts or theories on what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke.